It's a loss of millions of dollars. You know, we are living in a world that I looked at it in some sort of an accident, you know, that in life you can never know what you can expect, for good and for bad.
Golan has managed to clear his name, but the jury's still out on whether the tablet is a forgery or the real thing. If fake, a group of highly skilled craftsmen with a combined scholarly knowledge far beyond the scope of modern forgery engraved the sandstone tablet, planted fake material on it, and tried to pass it off as an ancient artifact.
Most of the difficulties, but yet I could not renew my company. It's a loss of millions of dollars. You know, we are living in a world that I looked at it in some sort of an accident, you know, that in life you can never know what you can expect, for good and for bad.
Golan has managed to clear his name, but the jury's still out on whether the tablet is a forgery or the real thing. If fake, a group of highly skilled craftsmen with a combined scholarly knowledge far beyond the scope of modern forgery engraved the sandstone tablet, planted fake material on it, and tried to pass it off as an ancient artifact. If it is real, it could be the incredible evidence that proves the existence of King Solomon's temple.
This is the story of the real Jesus Christ. The brutal world he lived in. The forces that shaped the man and his mission. For centuries, almost nothing was known about Jesus' childhood. Now, the latest science has revealed new information about the world he grew up in. An occupied land, ravaged by violence, disease, and injustice. Cruel times that inspired a message of hope in a young boy. 3 experts have embarked on a remarkable quest through the Holy Land in search of the historical Jesus. Byron McCain is an archaeologist who's excavated many biblical sites.
We don't dig with a Bible in one hand and a trowel in the other. Archaeology can't prove or disprove the Bible anyway. What it can do is to help us understand the world of the Bible better.
Rachel Haverlock is a professor of biblical studies who understands Jesus' religious roots, but also his political message.
Jesus was a Jew, and he was a Jew well-schooled in his Bible. He imagined himself in the line of prophets, and prophecy always had political dimension.
Alan Callahan is a Baptist minister and theologian who brings a modern eye to Bible texts.
We're not living in biblical times anymore. If we take seriously that these texts have some relation to our contemporary life, we must interpret them.
2,000 years ago, the Holy Land was a place of bloody oppression. It was part of the Roman Empire, which installed Jewish puppet kings to manage its interests. This world is not described by the Gospels. They're not history books. But it was the world Jesus was born into. The area Rome called Palestine was split into regions. The capital, Jerusalem, was in Judea. 80 miles north, past Samaria, lay Galilee. Up in the hills of Galilee, off the beaten track, was the tiny village of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Today, Nazareth is a bustling Arab town. Rachel Haverlock and Byron McCain traveled here to the Church of the Annunciation. In this place, according to the Gospel of Luke, an angel told Jesus' mother Mary that she was to become pregnant by the Holy Spirit.
She's told that she will conceive, which is unfathomable to her since she's engaged but hasn't had any sexual relations with her husband. So the angel says to her, "You will bear a son and name him Jesus."
In reality, this would have been a frightening revelation. Mary was not married to Joseph. Under ancient Jewish law, becoming pregnant out of wedlock was a crime punishable by stoning.
Mary, Jesus' mother, is in an extremely difficult position. She finds herself pregnant, and to all outside onlookers, she is a woman who has really broken all of the social mores and has been involved in some kind of illicit sexuality.
According to the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph had been told of Mary's miraculous conception by an angel. Then, before Jesus was born, the couple was forced to leave Nazareth. Luke's Gospel says that Joseph and Mary had to make the grueling 90-mile journey to Bethlehem to be counted in a Roman tax census. This was where Joseph's family originally came from. Alan Callahan is in Bethlehem, at the Church of the Nativity, a place of pilgrimage since before the 4th century. It commemorates the traditional birthplace of Jesus. Every Christian child learns that Jesus was born in Bethlehem on Christmas Day in the first year of our Lord, and in a stable. But do history and archaeology back up the gospel story? Most scholars now agree that Jesus was not born in the stable, which has become such a traditional part of Christmas. That's a notion that grew out of a single line in the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus was laid in a manger, that is, an animal feed trough.
Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn.
You got the wise men, and you got the shepherds, and then you got all those animals, and they had the family, and all of that is very charming and traditional, but in that configuration, it really doesn't jive with what we know of the historical circumstances surrounding his birth.
What we do know about the time is that there was very little wood to build stables in a land of rock and desert. The place that pilgrims have been visiting for centuries and is thought to be Jesus' birthplace is not a stable at all. It's a cave underneath the Church of the Nativity.
That's where the masonry stops. Some of the bedrock of the cave is still visible here.
Could Jesus have been born in a cave? Cave dwellings certainly existed in the time of Jesus. Back in Nazareth, Rachel visited a partial reconstruction of the hillside village as it might have been. It shows how a cave would have formed part of a first-century house. Claire Fan is an instructor in New Testament studies at the University of the Holy Land and advised on the construction of this site.
This is the kind of basement cave that might have been like the place that Mary gave birth to Jesus. It's the lower level of a house. and carved out of very soft limestone.
So it's like a wine cellar.
It's like a wine cellar. The temperature stays very even throughout the whole year. It's protected from the environment. You could use a natural cave, or you could carve it and enlarge a place to be able to store olive oil and wine and perhaps grains and precious items down here throughout the year.
Caves were also used to shelter animals, so a manger or feeding trough would not have been out of place here. But why would Mary have given birth in such a place, and not in a normal room? The answer lies in a simple translation mistake. The Gospels were written more than 50 years after Jesus' death, in Greek, the language used by educated scribes.
They laid him in a manger because there was no room in the inn. But that inn is a very funny word. It really is a word that in Greek means the guest room or the upper room.
Mary may well have gone into labor in just such an upper floor room, but then have been moved before the delivery.
The house is full. There's no privacy upstairs, and so what do? The suggestion is that perhaps Mary gave birth in the basement.
The evidence points to Jesus having been born in a basement cave, and almost certainly not in a stable. What we think we know about the birth of Jesus doesn't always match the archaeological evidence. Can we be sure that it happened in Bethlehem, or even on Christmas Day? Our image of a peaceful Christmas nativity. No pain relief, no modern medical procedures, and a high risk of infection.
Birth was terrifying. It was a fraught and dangerous time. Mary could have been as young as 13 or 14. Women likely spent much of their adult lives either giving birth to children, pregnant, or breastfeeding, and they also saw many of their relatives and friends die in childbirth. So it was an extremely fraught time.
As childbearing was so dangerous, does it make sense that the heavily pregnant Mary would have made the arduous journey to Bethlehem? There might be another reason why the Gospels place Jesus' birth there. To fulfill the Old Testament idea that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem.
In the Jewish tradition, the Messiah must be from the house of David. And David comes from the town of Bethlehem. So from a Jewish perspective, the Messiah can come from nowhere else but Bethlehem.
So a birth in Bethlehem matches the message the gospel writers wanted to convey. But there's an even bigger question mark over the exact timing of the nativity.
Jesus was not born on the 25th of December in the year 0. I mean, that much we know.
We know because the monk who devised our modern calendar in the 6th century made a simple mistake in his math when he calculated the first year AD. So when was Jesus actually born? There is little hard evidence.
When this was happening, in real time, historically speaking, nobody cared. People didn't keep detailed records of the births or deaths of poor people.
The Gospel of Matthew tells us Jesus was born during the reign of the Jewish king Herod the Great. And most scholars now place his birth just before Herod's death, in about 4 BC. Having survived birth, Jesus now had to survive childhood. His prospects for survival would not have been good. In this rural backwater, poverty, hunger, and disease were constant companions. Nazareth was a small village, perhaps only a few hundred inhabitants strong. Jesus' family was not destitute, but life was not easy for poor working people like them. Men and women labored long and hard just to scrape by. Everyone had to contribute to family life from an early age. When times were good in this hot, dusty world, the staple foods were olives, bread, milk, perhaps a little cheese, rarely meat. But all too often, a wholesome meal would have been unavailable. Evidence of recurring famine in the time of Jesus has been found by examining the bones of people from his region. Such work has been carried out at the Sakla Medical School in Tel Aviv. Byron McCain traveled here to meet physical anthropologist Israel Hershkovitz. He studied a unique collection of skeletons from first-century Galilee. To his expert eye, they tell a chilling tale.
Being a child was not easy at that period. There's a lot of evidence of malnutrition, judging from the bones.
When children are starving, their bone growth is arrested, causing something known as Harris lines, which can be seen in X-rays.
Most of the children have what we call Harris line. Among children of the 1st century AD, it's a very common phenomenon. I would say tough line during the 1st century AD.
The funerals of children were a regular occurrence. 50% of children never reached the age of 5. Around the humid Sea of Galilee, malaria was a common affliction. Infectious disease was rife, as were lice and other parasites. But out of hardship grew compassion. Archaeological evidence shows that even severely disabled people were well looked after within their extended families, and many lived to an advanced age.
The experience of being in a family at that time is an experience that involves more encounters with death than we're used to. But those encounters with death, the number of children who died, don't lead them to be indifferent toward life.
Absolutely.
They take care of those who are living.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's fascinating.
That's fascinating. You know, actually, without your family, at that time, you're okay.
Yeah, you're lost.
Professor Hershkovitz's research has revealed that intermarriage was common within the close-knit communities of Galilee in Jesus' time. People shared similar physical features, such as skull shape.
This is a skull of a 12 years old child, and you can see here it's the typical skull shape, what we call the egg shape, where the back part is very wide, while the anterior part, the forehead, is very narrow. This is very typical to the population of the 1st century.
This is especially common in the northern part of the country, this pattern you're talking about.
To get a more vivid look at a young Galilean boy, Professor Hershkovitz allowed the skull to undergo a state-of-the-art CT scan. From this, an expert will be able to recreate the face that once belonged to this 12-year-old from 2,000 years ago. Because the skull type is so typical of the time and place, this reconstruction will be the closest it is possible to get to the face of the young Jesus himself. The Ubers revolves around the question of facts.
This is like CSI Vatican City.
The Gospels say little about Jesus' formative years, but the latest history and archaeology have revealed a great deal about life in first century Galilee. The Holy Family is often seen as just Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. In reality, Jesus grew up in an extended family.
Jesus grows up in a house full of children whose names we know, brothers and sisters who are named in the Gospel.
Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us?
The average family had about 4 children. Older and younger generations lived together. Some believe that Joseph was a widower and that Jesus' brothers and sisters were children from a previous marriage. Without a doubt, his family would have been intimately entwined with the wider community of Nazareth. Life in a small village would have been a major influence on any growing boy like Jesus. Was the compassion he showed for others in his later teachings rooted in his own experience? If it was well known that he had been conceived out of wedlock, he might have been a victim of gossip, even bullying.
That means that Jesus grows up as a kind of an outsider, feels always on the margins, and begins to identify with those on the margins.
But the champion of the poor and dispossessed might have gotten his sense of mission more directly. What if Mary explained the mystery of his birth, as the Gospels say it was revealed to her?
Imagine if your mother tells you throughout your youth that you're the Son of God, or this is known to you through some kind of revelation.
For one or both of these reasons, Jesus would have felt different from an early age. And yet he was also a boy from an ordinary, poor family. By the time he was 12, he would have started to work with his older brothers and father, probably learning their trade. Joseph is usually called a carpenter, but the Gospels were written in Greek, and the word used was tekton. This means someone who works with his hands. In a place where the most common building material was stone, Joseph may well have been a mason. He might have made or repaired tools, or been a general builder.
The significant thing about tekton is that it shows that he doesn't belong to a family which makes its income from the produce of land. He goes out each day and makes something that he basically sells, or sells his labor.
This kind of historical detail about Jesus' world has been revealed by the latest research. But we still don't know much about what the young Jesus might have looked like until now. The skull of a 12-year-old boy from Galilee in the time of Jesus has been scanned and a 3D image produced for analysis by medical artist Caroline Needham. She's part of the team at the world's leading Center for Facial Reconstruction in Dundee, Scotland. A high-tech virtual sculpting tool allowed her literally to feel her way around the skull. Tiny clues in the bone indicate to an expert where muscles would have been attached. They form the base layer of soft tissue, shaping the face. Caroline placed pegs in key positions to indicate how thick the rest of the flesh should be, based on data from scans of living people.
The data set that we use for this individual is going to be for a male of his age from roughly the same population group. And they're taken at specific anatomical landmarks, so it gives an overall map of the face.
After sketching in the underlying muscle structure, Caroline worked with graphic artist Dasha Lake to build up the soft tissue. And the face of a first-century Galilean boy, the same age as Jesus, began to emerge.
But they pass to the skin a little bit.
Using a CT scan of a 12-year-old boy from first-century Galilee, forensic artists have almost completed a recreation of his face.
So, kind of getting there? Yeah, they're not going to be particularly light skinned. I think kind of olive brown skin, dark hair, dark eyes.
When complexion and hair color were factored in, based on data typical of the region, the final portrait came to life.
It's interesting because it doesn't look like our westernized view of the face of Jesus. It doesn't have the blonde hair, the blue eyes. And although this clearly also isn't the face of Jesus, it's a contemporary. It's someone from that time and that place.
That time and that place were in the throes of seismic economic and political change. The effect of Rome's occupation of the Holy Land was felt even in rural Galilee. Back around the time when Jesus was born, Jews had rebelled against their hated Roman overlords in the town of Sepphoris, just 4 miles from Nazareth. Mary and Joseph may well have looked on as Roman legions moved in and destroyed the place. In the years that followed, as Jesus was growing up, Sepphoris was rebuilt by Rome's puppet king, Herod Antipas. It would have stood out in this sparsely populated area, a Roman-style city, reminding everyone of the burgeoning influence of the empire.
The rebuilding of Sepphoris and the beginning of Romanization in the Galilee has very significant consequences for the kind of world Jesus grows up in.
With Sepphoris less than an hour's walk away from Nazareth, it was the obvious place for Jesus' family to go to sell their wares. They were probably even poorer than peasant farmers, who at least owned a patch of land. It's likely that Jesus' mother and sisters made cloth, and in Sepphoris there were people with money to buy it. The currency at the time was a mix of Roman and local coins.
We're standing on the hillside near Nazareth looking toward Zippori, Sepphoris, the largest city in the area at that time. Nazareth is one of a number of villages in orbit around Sepphoris. This is a view that the historical Jesus would have seen countless times during his life growing up and living in Nazareth.
The city they would have seen is slowly emerging again, thanks to 25 years of excavations. Byron McCain walked down the main street with Jonathan Reed, who is an expert on this site and how its archaeology relates to Jesus.
This is comprehensive urban planning with a vision of laying out the city in a very orderly, and not just orderly, but an orderly Roman way.
Exactly. It bespeaks of Romanization.
Yep.
It bespeaks of trying to control the population. There's a form of social control, and there's, of course, also political control. And that's one of the hallmarks of a Roman city.
The global brand of Rome had arrived amongst the poor villages of Galilee, bringing construction and engineering on a scale the locals had never seen before. The economy was changing fast too. On a Sepphoris market day, the young Jesus must have been all too aware of the increasing gulf between poor people like him and the wealthy few. Houses that have been unearthed in Sepphoris show just how rich some local Jews were becoming.
Well, this is a place that I've spent an awful lot of time since 1988. I've been coming here and excavating.
The priestly classes, landowners, merchants, and tax collectors were all adopting Roman styles.
So this would have been the grand reception room. It's been badly burned and damaged, but you have what at one time was a beautiful plaster floor, and all of the walls along here were covered with fresco in very Roman style, red colors, green colors, very, very beautiful. This would have been kind of, I think, the showpiece of the house. You have kind of a Roman veneer over an essentially Jewish home.
To what extent do you think Jesus would have been aware of this kind of prosperity?
To me, it's pretty clear that Jesus, even if he doesn't come inside this house, he understands just by looking at the outside of it, even from a distance, that there are people that have sort of a much higher level wealth and status than he does.
These people were doing well out of the Roman occupation. Others were less fortunate. Heavy taxes forced many to sell the land they subsisted on. They were reduced to finding casual work, day by day.
We find parables about day laborers. We even see these people. You know, you see folks that have come, they're standing on a street corner for the day, and somebody comes by and picks them up for work. Usually people don't choose that as a career. These are people who have lost their land. You know, all they have to give in what is now a market is their labor.
Small farmers in particular feel the squeeze and end up having to sell their land in order to pay taxes or debts or bills. And so Jesus is living in a place where he would have seen the dislocations, and he would have seen some people getting ahead while others are falling behind.
This economic turmoil must have affected the young Jesus. Although raised as a tradesman in Joseph's footsteps, everyone had to help in the fields at harvest time. Jesus' knowledge of agriculture emerges later in his parables, with their images of sowing seeds and trees bearing fruit. The parables also deal with the conflict between rich landowners and their tenants or workers.
What you have with urbanization is you have a growing upper class, but also you have more people that are sort of falling off of the land. And they're falling off of the land because these people are grabbing some of that land. And of course, Jesus' stories in the gospel, the parable of the vineyard, really relate to what we see archaeologically happening in Galilee.
People in Jesus' time felt the pain of Roman rule, in their pockets and in their bellies. But when the occupiers began to insult the Jewish religion, the Jews rose up. All new season of Forbidden History starts April 19th at 10 only on EHC. When Jesus was about 12 years old, the Romans ordered a census of the Jewish people to assess them for yet more taxes. The decree sparked a ferocious uprising among the Jews, who believed taxes should be paid only to God. But the rebels were no match for the forces of Rome.
At the end of that rebellion, like so many rebellions against Rome, thousands were crucified as an example to the local population. What would happen to them if they disobeyed Roman power again?
The fervor that drove the Jews to rise up against their pagan masters was rooted in a profound religious faith. Jewish law prescribes 1 day a week, the Sabbath, to rest and study the teachings of the Hebrew Bible, or Torah. In a small village like Nazareth, the faithful would have gathered in any convenient space, perhaps the courtyard of a large house. This was called a synagogue, the Greek word for gathering. The Torah would have been read in Hebrew by educated local men or village elders, and then translated into the everyday language of the Jews, Aramaic.
And then they would hear some kind of dazzling preacher from the neighborhood. A preacher was someone who could speak to everyone. So if someone like Jesus wanted to speak to a crowd and impress them, it would certainly be done through preaching.
But could Jesus read and write? Learning to read the Torah in the original Hebrew is today central to every devout Jewish boy's education. Rachel thinks this also might have been the case in Jesus' time.
A young boy around Jesus' age would have known his Torah. He would hear it read publicly in the synagogue on Saturday, and he likely would spend a few hours over the course of the week learning how to read it.
There can be no proof of Jesus' level of literacy, but according to gospel stories, he had a sophisticated knowledge of Scripture. The idea of the local synagogue was a relatively new one in Jesus' time. For the main religious festivals, devout Jews always tried to make the journey to the center of their faith, the temple in Jerusalem. This cost time and money that families like Jesus's could ill afford. It was also dangerous. People traveled in groups for safety. Some of those left behind by the economic changes of the time became bandits, like the ones who attacked the man in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan.
The problem of banditry is recurrent through early Roman Palestine. Bandits are people who can't make it anymore playing by the rules, so they opt out of the system. They don't live in the towns and villages. They hide out in places like this, and feeling themselves sort of left by the side of the road, they prey upon those who travel down the road. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a good story illustrating the risks of travel.
Arriving at Jerusalem from the countryside for the first time must have been an overwhelming experience for a 12-year-old boy. A poor boy from Nazareth, confronted with almost unimaginable wealth and power. It must have been a life-changing moment for Jesus.
America's #1 team is.
In first century Palestine, Jerusalem was the center of both religious and political power. At its heart was a spectacular temple. The vast platform it was built on still dominates the city. It was the grandest of all Herod the Great's building projects. But the temple was totally destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD.
What we're seeing behind us isn't even the whole temple. This is just the retaining wall for the platform upon which this temple stood. And it's impressive. So you can imagine what the temple looked like in antiquity. Ancient writers talk about it shimmering in the sunlight. Herod created here, first of all, a tourist attraction. People from all around the empire wanted to come and see this great structure that he had created.
For the Jewish faithful, the temple was far more than a stunning building. It was the focal point of their faith. They believed that God actually lived here, and the Jews worshipped only this one God. Theirs was the first Western religion to have no other.
The temple served the purpose of religious center, political capital, and also the place of contact between Israel and God. The whole notion of a kind of a Jewish or Judean or Israelite state is that God resides at the center.
Jesus was 12 years old when he came here with his family for the festival of Passover, along with tens of thousands of others. The Gospel of Luke tells how Jesus got separated from Mary and Joseph in the crowds.
When Jesus' mother, Mary, realizes that he disappeared, we really see that Jesus had a Jewish mother, because she becomes filled with worry and anxiety and is running around high and low looking for her child.
According to Luke, Jesus was found listening to teachers and asking questions. They were amazed at his understanding.
And when she finds him, the first thing she says is, you've been dying with worry. How could you do this to us? Yeah. Then when she sees how smart he is, she's really proud. So here we get the two poles of the Jewish mother: intense worry followed by incredible pride in her son.
At the Jerusalem temple, the central ritual of ancient Judaism was animal sacrifice. Sprinkled blood and burnt offerings were seen as a way of communicating with God. Sacrifices could happen only in the temple. The priests had a monopoly on performing them. Only they were allowed up into the great raised altar, where the rites were carried out.
I often think of it sort of like a modern-day rock concert. Throngs of people gathered in the courts to watch the proceedings. The performance of the temple cult itself was pure spectacle.
The Jewish priests were an elite group, beyond the reach of the common people. Jesus must have been struck by their wealth and prestige, yet another reminder of the growing separation of rich and poor during his lifetime. In order to be allowed to continue with religious practice at the temple, the priests had done a deal with the ruling Roman authorities.
For the priests, the stakes were incredibly high, that the temple stand, that the sacrifices continue, because from the priestly worldview, without the temple, there would be no religion, no state, no territory, nothing.
Maybe collaborating with the Romans was a necessary evil, but it also afforded the priests a very privileged lifestyle. This can be seen clearly from the remains of their magnificent houses. They were discovered when Jerusalem was redeveloped in the 1960s and have been preserved in an underground museum beneath a modern apartment block. Professor Dan Bahat is a former city archaeologist of Jerusalem.
We are standing here in one of the most beautiful homes which we have in this priestly neighborhood. The way by which people lived here was a very wealthy way. You see the houses, you see the frescoes, you see the mosaics. Everything is very, very lavishly done, and therefore we can understand the standard of living here was very, very high.
Do you think that there would be others, common people, poor people, that would resent the kind of leisure
Yes.
that the priests enjoyed?
Definitely, definitely.
The priest's luxurious way of life and the spectacle of the temple would have been a revelation to an impressionable young visitor from the countryside like Jesus, but not necessarily a positive one.
When people come here, they see something that they don't see anywhere where they come from. The scale, the sheer scale of what they see here, the concentration of power. This place really is almost an obscene contrast to the poverty that I left back home. That these people, the ruling class that's so comfortably ensconced here, couldn't possibly represent my interests.
Ordinary Jews felt a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the temple elite. Some were even breaking with the organized religion centered in Jerusalem and setting up Jewish splinter sects.
Around this time, there are a number of groups who had decided that they could do without the temple. That this train has jumped the track and there's something very wrong here, irremediably so.
These populist movements were really reacting against the spectacle of the temple. They really dreamed of an alternate Judaism.
As he grew into manhood, Jesus was drawn to just such a breakaway group, led by a preacher named John the Baptist. This encounter was the beginning of Jesus' own extraordinary mission. The Gospels tell of marvels and a message of hope for the oppressed people of Palestine. But to the Roman and Jewish ruling elite, Jesus and his teachings were an outrage and a threat to be crushed without mercy. This is the story of the real Jesus Christ, the brutal world he lived in, the forces that shaped the man and his mission, and how he went from being a humble workman to a charismatic leader with thousands of followers and a revolutionary message. History and archaeology can now unearth where Jesus preached, what influenced his teachings, and science can reveal how Jesus might have looked as an adult. Jesus, a people's crusader on a lethal collision course with the Roman Empire. Theologian and Baptist minister Alan Callahan are unearthing remarkable evidence about the man and his times. Rachel and Alan have come to the desert near the River Jordan, a key place in the young Jesus' life. The Jordan has long played a central role in the history of the Jewish people. It was here the river parted for Joshua and the Israelites. Here the prophet Elijah was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire.
Jordan's always been a place where people have kind of physical encounters with God.
Even today, it's a popular pilgrim site.